This is an IWP media production, brought to you by the Institute of World Politics, the independent accredited graduate school empowering the next generation of national security, intelligence, and international affairs experts. Learn from top scholar practitioners and acquire invaluable skills to propel your career. For more information, visit iwp.edu.
Okay, well, Happy New Year. A little belated, but Happy New Year, Ambassador Miller. It's great to have you back here at IWP. I'm your guest host, Glenn Korn. Proud to be a member of the IWP staff where I teach. And I want to give a shout out to the IWP team here, especially the folks that are doing this podcast to organize this very quickly for us in some very cold and icy conditions. So it's very brave of Alfred and the team to come in to do this, and we appreciate it. And of course, I want to just give a shout out to IWP in general. It's a great school. It's a great institution that represents, I think, the best of America and is dedicated to training the next generation of American foreign affairs experts, government employees, those people who want to serve their country in different ways, whether in the government or outside of the government, but share the values that many of us grew up with in believing in America and its greatness. So really happy to be part of that team, and I'm happy to be here with you. Last time we spoke, I think, was September. Is that correct?
I think so.
Yeah,
but
about
at
3
this
months.
stage, my memory means it was last year sometime.
It was last year. That is true. It was almost a year back.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So it's been about 3 months, I think, since our last podcast, and I want to ask you, how's it going, and what's news on the on your personal side and on the Diplomatic Studies Foundation front?
On my personal side,
Yeah.
the big note is I'm still alive, and the older I get, the more excited I get about being alive. So personally, things are grand.
Until taxes come, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, on the Diplomatic Studies side, same thing, fine report. We're in the last stages of preparing for the 6th execution of a peace game at USIP. And it continues to draw more interest, more people who are wrestling with two interesting and fundamental challenges. One is that for those who took notes and from our last presentation, they'll remember that the peace game is set on the west coast of Africa. Events are changing so rapidly on the west coast of Africa. That week, the French were asked to leave the Côte d'Ivoire. We're already losing, so to speak, northern pieces of Benin and Togo. So what looked to us perhaps a year ago when the scenario was developed in its final stage as we see it today, we're now already out of date, badly out of date in terms of cross-border threats. So dinner tonight, frankly, with a leading African analyst is get our scenario up to date.
Amen.
So that's going on.
Okay.
Secondly, the challenge is to spread the technique of the peace game. And let me expound a little bit on that. There is a peace game scenario built around an African country. And so sometimes people say, well, I wish you'd done Central America. I wish you'd done the Pacific Islands, whatever. You can do any geographic location in the teaching structure of the peace game.
Right.
So we're getting more people saying, is this relevant to the Middle East? The answer is, of course it is. All it is a complicated scenario developed by practitioners,
Right.
made into a game by the ICON simulation team up at Maryland,
Mm-hmm.
and hosted at an institution like USIP that says, we can do this. And one of the unique features is the fact that it has this Washington control team. Games that are run without Washington oversight are like Jack and Jill went up the hill, and at the top of the hill, they found a dog bone. The real world is you give us your best ideas from the field, and we'll tell you what you can do.
Right.
So that, as part of the technique of what we're doing, is important, and we continue to work on improving those two things, scenario and technique.
Well, there's so much to unpack there. And, before we move on, I want to ask you a question about how you're changing the scenario and how near-peer competition, especially our challenges and actually the fact that we're losing ground to the PRC in Africa and other parts of the world, how we're rolling that into the scenario. Because in my experience, the peace games did include some of that, but how are you going to amplify that and help better prepare our foreign affairs experts to deal with this challenge? And before I get to that question, although I just asked questions, so I'm kind of confusing myself.
Yes.
But on the piece about the Washington control, and the one comment I would make is, my view on this, we also need to teach our younger diplomats, our foreign affairs experts, how they need to take advantage of the authorities they already have and not always ask Washington for help or for advice and direction, because we're training people, selecting them and training them to put them in the field to actually make decisions. And when they're too reliant on Washington control, we lose opportunities. And of course, many people in Washington don't really know what's happening on the ground. So that's just my commentary, but I want to go back to the question for you.
I like the commentary.
Okay, well, let's start with the commentary.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on that?
Okay, you're better than many morning op-ed pieces in some of my favorite newspapers. Indeed, you've just hit upon a hugely important thing, and that is modern communication appears to make decision-making better because we're always in touch. But what that really says is that the superior authority is always in control. So if you're on a secure video and you're only an ambassador, and an assistant secretary or someone from the NSC can be there in real time all the time,
Right.
what you learn is don't do anything without calling home.
Right.
Now, that's sad because we pay you at post to have a better sense of reality than we have here in Washington.
Right.
If you don't, you ought to come home and pull for the commanders. It's who knows? I mean, Washington has to be explicit about the delegation of authority that they wish to grant, and don't call home unless it's a crisis.
Right.
One of my first private sector experiences in a large corporation was that I had failed to achieve something I really wanted to, and had told my boss, who was a group executive in a very senior job, that I had failed. And so I marched in to see this chap and said, Tommy, I failed. I didn't do this, right? And he said, that's great. That's fine. And I said, what? And he said, if you don't fail about 1 out of 5 times, you're not doing your job. And I said,
sounds like a good leader.
yeah.
He was with us. Yeah.
He was a tackle for Vince Lombardi at Fordham when Vince was the line coach.
The best American leader, maybe after Ronald Reagan. Vince Lombardi.
Exactly.
I'll get me going on Vince Lombardi quotes.
Oh, Vince, yeah. Vince, it was, I watched the Green Bay Packers films because of something else that's in the public sector, and that is Vince's line was, we all draw from the same pool. Some of us make players better. That's what a big corporation is like. At that point, we probably had 150,000 employees or something like that. Everybody's got the same pool.
Right.
Who makes people play better?
Right.
That's true for diplomatic services.
Right.
That's true in the public sector. how do you structure and train people to get them to the Super Bowl? Because it's the same group of kids.
And that's what DSF is focused on doing, correct? Training people
That's
to
right.
get to the Super Bowl.
Yep.
And going, but I just want to wrap up the piece on initiative or on like authorities. To me, the advantage we always had over a lot of our competitors was the fact that Americans, I mean, we say about the military, like we take initiative. We push authority down to the lowest possible level so that when, God forbid, the commander of a unit is taken out, the subordinates know what to do. Someone can take charge and make decisions. And that's, I think, what we need a little bit more reinvigoration of our foreign affairs community, because like we don't have the advantage maybe anymore, even technology wise or money wise, but we've always had the creativity and the ingenuity and the initiative advantage. And I hope we can retain it. And that's what you're focused on doing with DSF. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And that's part of the long discussion about education and training at state and at all the other civilian institutions. I'll leave out comments about the uniformed services, but the reason the private sector spends a lot of time at business schools and looking at management training is that the behavior of leaders is the ultimate key to success.
Right.
And we may get to this subject, but for example, at the State Department, there are a limited number of key player pieces, layers, that were they to perform better, the whole department would perform better.
Right.
And that's what a good business leader focuses on.
So I'm all about people taking initiative and not having to ask for permission, but let me check and see if I have permission to ask the next question from no. It's a little humor there. Okay, so let's transition.
It's my turn to interview Glenn. Now, this is Ed McMahon and Johnny Carson. We're trying to make something funny out of difficult.
You are correct, sir. Mwah.
Yeah.
Johnny Carson, the best.
Yes.
Uh,
He did the warm-up act for the Gettysburg Address.
So transition. Let's transition to transition. One of the things that happened in the last 3 months is we had a presidential election, congressional elections. We have a new administration coming back into office. We have one administration leaving. So we're going through presidential transition this month. And on the 20th, we'll have President Trump return to office. You have lived through, in your government service, presidential transitions. Anything you can share with our audience? And again, like I like to focus on some of our students here at IWP and other students that may be listening to this, younger federal employees who are going to go through maybe a transition for the first time. Yeah. Any words of wisdom, advice, thoughts, stories you can share?
Yes. First of all, I guess, is to quote my dear deceased friend Brent Scowcroft about presidential transitions and so on. Every presidential transition inherently brings a new set of policies. And the government employee has spent at least 4 years pursuing the policies of the preceding administration. And there's always a wrenching bit of, geez, this isn't like the last administration, which is almost inherently true. That's why we have elections. But there was a time in the earlier days of George Herbert Walker Bush's administration and General Scowcroft's national security, second go-around as a national security advisor, in which I thought I had a better idea than the president. And General Scowcroft kindly reminded me that President Bush ran for office and he won.
Right.
And so we're going to do what he thinks is the right way to do this. So it's nice that I have an opinion, but that's sort of the end of it. Now, in every transition, I went from Ramsey Clark to John Mitchell at the Justice Department. I went from President Reagan to George Herbert Walker Bush at the NSC. it's a new team. It'll have a new structure. It'll have new values. It'll have new objectives. You need to sit back and say to yourself, I'm a professional government employee. My obligation is to the Constitution. It is to make this government work. So that's a message for any transition. And any transition is difficult. In particular, in my experience at the NSC, I had a number of operating accounts in the drugs and thugs area. We're worried about hostages and intervention of drug traffic and so on. So your office is responsible on a daily basis of keeping track of real world, sometimes high risk things where families are worried about hostages or law enforcement people are 2/3 of the way through an operation. And the transition from Reagan to Bush was traditional, and that is General Scowcroft met with all the old NSC staffers and said, President Reagan's very appreciative of your service, but you all get to go back to private life or back to the parts of the government from which you came. Now, if you have an operational account at the NSC, that's sort of dumb. I was blessed with a fellow named Randy Beers, who some of you may well know, who went a long way up in many different parts of the government, including DHS. But as we left the meeting in which Randy was told it was time for him to go back somewhere, I was talking with Randy, walking around the third floor at the EOB, and Randy began to rattle through the exercises and where we were because he was leaving. Now, if you're from the private sector and you listen to the guy who knows really how to run the operations and your orders are to get rid of him, the right response is, nope, we're not. Right. So the best thing I did probably in a couple of years was I walked back across West Exec, sat down with Brent, and I said, we cannot send Randy Beers back to wherever he might go. And Brent did his dutiful, well, that's what the president wants. And I said, but sir, that's not responsible. So if you're in the middle of a transition now, figure out what you really need to protect to keep the government running smoothly and determine what really is a justifiable change in direction and policy that a new administration has every right to pursue.
Right. And another good example of your leadership, I think, by going back to Brent Scowcroft and saying, I think you're making a mistake, and having the courage to do that. Right. So good on you. That's why I like you. So do I like you? I don't.
Was that it? So speaking about transitions, a good thing we don't do this too often, in particular for public consumption.
Yes.
Okay.
Speaking about the transition
Yes.
issue, now we have, the talk about DOGE and
Sure.
probably big reforms. At least there's a lot of talk about reform coming to the federal government, including, I'm going to guess, the foreign affairs community, the national security apparatus.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you think that it's necessary, and how would you approach it?
I could start off with one of my humorous lines on that, and that is, if you bought the State Department, what would you do? Which has elicited all sorts of responses. In my case, quite specifically, it's got me back to fundamentals, I think, and that is, all the department has is people. So all the department offers are the skills of those people, which gets you to education and training. The better we make the department officials, the more likely we are to implement successful change,
right?
Successful different approaches to policies, And so that's my sense of change is a fine thing, almost zero-based intellectual budgeting, which is to say, what are we trying to achieve and why are we trying to achieve it?
Right.
And then again, if you're a private sector type, there is how do we achieve it by spending less money and getting more out of it, which gets back to talking to some of my friends to say, if you bought that apartment, what would you do? And that's sort of how you look at it. What are we doing that needs more support? What are we doing that is a leftover idea? And in a transition, that's a perfect time to sit back, get a whiteboard, and say, what are we up to?
I'm trying to remember the name of the very wise gentleman who said during testimony in Congress that regarding the State Department, I've never seen an organization that invests so much in recruiting the best and the brightest and then invests so little and does so little to actually provide them with leadership training.
Yeah, he's a guy that has these fancy titles.
Yeah, who was that guy?
Yeah.
So do you think this is an opportunity now to drive home that point and maybe drive some much needed reform there?
Sure it is.
And what would that reform look like in your opinion? And how, what is the message to people that are going to be taking over the department and other parts of the foreign affairs community?
If you look only at my little area of concern, which is education and training and people, I think in particular at this very moment, there's an opportunity for an incoming secretary to step back, put education and training in a little box and say, everybody that's doing the great policy issues, how many Palestinian states will it take to bring peace to the Middle East? We can all argue that. At the same time, we ought to be able to walk and chew gum. We ought to be able to take some talent and put it on improving education and training, right? And separate those buckets, because historically, policy is what real people do, and education and training is something that follows along. And that's wrong. State needs to elevate, protect the budget of, hire. We've just created a new post at the Foreign Service Institute for a provost. There's a lot that could be done, I think, that would improve education and training at state. But this incoming secretary needs to get a small group of folks and say, come back with your ideas. And I don't want a commission that is back in 2 years. I want new ideas in 60 days.
Right. Yeah, I will share something I wrote recently for one of the think tanks that I am associated with. They asked, for the new team coming in, like, what do you think the highest priority, national security priority is? And I said, it's doing this reform, because we need reform. We need some change. It has to be done very quickly and smartly, because we're still faced with all the challenges. I always say that the outgoing director of the CIA, Bill Burns, talks about all the threats that we're facing. And I think we all see that anyone that works in the geopolitical space, the United States today is facing a serious number of threats. We're we're at war with some countries, I think, in their minds.
Yes.
And we have to make the change. So I agree with you. The change has got to happen. The discussion has to happen, but it can't take 2 years in the bureaucracy. Whoever's going to do it needs to do it very quickly. And I also think that this is where the private sector, public sector partnership can really help, because, you talk about organizations like DSF and other people that want to see change. They can probably help without drawing off resources that the foreign affairs community needs to continue to use to focus on the forward-facing mission, right? The immediate threats that we're facing daily around the world.
Yes.
So,
and they range from the obvious threats. The Ukraine is short of 105 rounds. To the not so obvious threats, which is, let's see, the Austrians have just elected a far right president. Now, as I understand from reading the public newspapers here, he's concerned about immigration. Okay. As are many other countries. And I wrote a few years ago, the problem of refugees is an existential threat. What does that mean? It's relatively simple. Eventually, the inability of the world to protect people where they live, to provide employment and food and hope, leads to a mass movement of people who are desperate. That threatens the stability of many places.
Mm-hmm.
And so the threat environment runs all the way from things that go bang to people starving to death, to which you say, well, people are starving to death, but that's not our problem. And the answer is, you can see that problem everywhere.
Right. Yes. I mean, maybe the best example of this right now is Syria, which has just gone through a major change. It's going through a major change, and it was a source of a lot of illegal or migration, which caused a lot of problems for countries in the region, including countries that are near and dear to my heart, that suffered and had to deal with large numbers of Syrian refugees who were fleeing from oppression, who were fleeing from war,
Yes.
starvation. Now they have an opportunity to go home, and hopefully that, we with our partners can get it right and help the Syrian regime or the new government create conditions so that the people can go home and stay in Syria and live prosperous lives.
Yes.
And so to that point, like, let's say that we're creating a new embassy today or reopening the embassy in Damascus. The key elements, what would you say that you need in that country team, which we talk about all the time, the leadership team that would work with the new ambassador to drive the positive change in policies or help our partners there in the Syrian government make change? Who would they be, and how would you run that team? If you were the new ambassador, who would you want?
Who you want depends upon how you want to win the game. So what does winning the game in Syria look like? And at that point, I think essentially you say a stable, accountable government that works for the Syrian citizenry, all of them, that encourages people to come home. Now that then takes a mix of public support, for public money support for public institutions. It also takes physical security. But most importantly, and something that we've not done a great job of dealing with, it takes investment capital and the involvement of the United States private sector in ways that we have not yet imagined. And we're going to have to, because our ideological enemies are saying, this capitalist system is terrible. It doesn't do any good for you. You people don't come here unless you can take things from us. And the answer is no. Actually, capitalism, this is a little bit of my education, mercantilism and capitalism are different systems. And capitalism grows a pie, and mercantilism generally does not. It struggles over dividing the pie in different ways. We need, in a Syrian embassy, a way to reach out to the American private sector to say, here's what Syria looks like. Here are government assets. We can share these with you. What would it take you to come here and help rebuild things that produce energy and products and train people and transfer technology or so? So that's were 20 years younger, I'd be more than happy to go to Damascus and say, hey,
Right. But how would you do that? I mean, what is your recommendation to the new administration? Because I agree with you, and those companies need to see, those investors need to see there's some security and there's some profit for them. I mean, let's be realistic.
Yep.
So how do we make it a win-win? Like, what can the U.S. government do? Can the State Department do? Can the Department of Commerce do to all the players that would be part of the country team?
Yep.
What do we need to do better to
Mhm.
to grow the private sector, public sector partnership
I
in the foreign affairs world?
Oh, that's a wonderful question because
I know you told me to ask it. I wrote it down. So sorry.
God, we just blew it. We just blew it again. Ed McMahon said, "You told me to ask that, Johnny." Okay. What you do, I think, where I still back in government, in particular, let's say at the NSC, and the incoming administration understands that the successful engagement of the U.S. private sector is important in countries that are important. And there's an argument that Syria is important. It is easier for the NSC to convene a government-wide group than for the State Department. And that group has got to involve economists and lawyers, and this has got to be a whole of government. We could do this, and then it's the Chamber of Commerce or it's whatever structure in the private sector is comfortable reaching out. And we DSF have had good relations and support from a few people at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce who have cared about this game. And you get everybody in the room and you say, what about tax credits? Say what? Well, let's see. Let's suppose we could spend $500 million of USAID money in Syria, and it would largely be well spent. Suppose you said to U.S. companies, we'll give you partial tax credit of up to X amount if you invest that money in Syria.
Right.
That would be like what Brazil did to move private capital up to the northeast, up to Recife and so on. Or you say, we will help you set up a breakaway private sector structure where you take a company, and I've talked to some companies that have said, we'd be happy to invest in high-risk places, but we won't put our employees at risk, period. It has nothing to do with financial return.
Right.
Okay, maybe you look at the Uniform Commercial Code and you say, we will allow the creation of a specially licensed vehicle to take the products of General Electric, put them into GE Nuco that gets some support from the U.S. government, that gets some special tax breaks and so on and so forth, to experiment with Syria. Now, that may sound really stupid, and it wouldn't surprise me because it's entirely off the cuff. But it's how I wish people would think about this. And that is, take a lawyer, take an economist, take an intelligence officer, take a non-kinetic, normal kinetic engagement officer, and say, how do we get people to go to Syria? No.
Right. I think one of the things, I mean, we were talking about this, so I don't even know how many of our listeners know that the Department of Commerce has people in our embassies around the world. And by the way, some of the best American diplomats I ever work with, when we say diplomat, it's not always State Department. It's not always, it's not a guy or a gal at a cocktail reception, chatting with somebody. But there are people out there promoting U.S. business, doing great stuff. My experience with the FCS teams, foreign commercial service, was they're really good. They're doers.
Yeah.
And of course, we have a bunch of other people that are part of any embassy structure.
Yep.
That are also extremely talented and doing a lot of stuff. And one of the things, I may have said this during the last podcast, but I'll say it again because I keep thinking about it, is with the peace games, what you created, this module, this training scenario is even people, let's say it's State Department or people in other parts of the U.S. foreign affairs community, don't necessarily know what other parts of the community are doing or can do.
Yeah.
And when you put them in that kind of permissive environment where they can interact and find out that actually I can go to the commercial attaché and she may be able to open a door that I can't open up because nobody wants to talk to the guy who's doing political affairs or economic affairs, but they want to talk to someone who can bring in a U.S. corporation or U.S. investors, right? Or maybe, I'm the press guy and I need some access where maybe I should talk to my partners in the military because they may have some relationships or some, public affairs capabilities that I don't have that are organic here, that they have. Right. And so this is one of the things I think listeners should know about what you've created is a great kind of incubator for engagement, collaboration, and ideas in a safe setting where people do that here in Washington before they actually are deployed to the field. And they're in, let's say, Damascus, setting up a new embassy, and things are going crazy, and they don't have time to learn all these things, right? So, or they have to learn it on the fly, which is sometimes not the best way to learn. So
Learn it here.
learn it here.
Yeah, but one of the things I'm fond of saying during a peace game is, if you're at the NSC, the phone can ring anytime during a 24-hour day, which is almost the entire day. And so people are downrange and they're trying to do something in their embassy and they have an idea and they don't know if they can do it. So they eventually call the NSC and they want legal authority to do X. Why can't we think of that here before it's a real life crisis? And you can't figure out how to offload medicines from a C-141 that have been donated, and they're at Dover and they're ready to go, but nobody knows quite how to transfer title. Oh, well, the donor isn't going to maintain medical responsibility for their donated stuff. Well, who owns it? Where's it going? How do you run that transition? That's a simple little problem. The bigger issue that affects the private sector is the whole structure of how they get to an opportunity overseas that's reasonable financially and has, as best you can, limited the legal risks of suddenly appearing in Damascus to open up a small fractional horsepower motor plant, whatever.
And I should say this too. We're talking a lot about the Middle East, and Syria, of course, an important country, but we should also not forget the fact, and I've been harping on this for a while, that our own Western Hemisphere needs a lot of attention.
Jeez.
And there's a lot of opportunity,
Sure.
But we've lost ground. And of course, everybody in the foreign affairs community is going to have to, I would say, do a surge to address a lot of the issues, which include illegal, migration, which is being encouraged by some of the dictatorial regimes in the region. Our near-peer competitors are buying up ports, they're buying up access, they're buying up things that are causing us problems. And again, this is an area where the private sector and the U.S. government need to work hand in glove to protect and maybe reassert U.S. influence in a positive way for the peoples of those countries. What are your thoughts on that region, that market? Western Hemisphere.
I followed Hutchison Whampoa for a period of time, and they've obviously they're part of the great Chinese community, and they have some arrangements to own, lease, or control the commercial ports at either end of the canal. They do that well. Hutchison Whampoa is a successful, well-run company. That's who we're competing with. And they enjoy benefits of close cooperation with their government,
Right.
which gives them a huge advantage.
Right.
For whatever ideological, historical reasons, we don't have that level of cooperation today. So let's back up 15 sentences ago, and you say you need the private sector talking with the normal institutions that you would expect, commerce and so on. And you've got to add the intelligence community somehow or other. And then you need to add some of the military community. I've had the opportunity to talk to some of our special forces people who've worked in Africa to say, if you were going to invest in X country and people came to you and said, how could we improve the security of our facility? the guys smile and they say, we spend all day trying to figure out how to attack facilities like that,
Right.
or protect facilities like that. Do you think anybody comes to us when the architectural drawings are just there? They haven't even been blue penciled with additions? No.
Right.
How is the USG affecting control of their build?
Right.
It's crazy that our country is not able to do that.
Well, I mean, the whole government approach probably needs to start well before you start investing in building a new facility or building a new compound. And
Yeah.
I would agree with you on that. And my experience is probably the same as what our military colleagues mentioned to you. So hopefully we can do better there. It's something, again, that the new team should look at very seriously. And, as you mentioned, like the military, I also have to say, and especially if we're talking about the Western Hemisphere, but anywhere around the world today too, what I've saw in my last 15 years, 20 years of service was the expansion and the importance of having our law enforcement community in those country teams as well. So, I had some great experiences with HSI, DHS, of course, the FBI partners that we had that can do a lot of things, and they bring a lot to the table. And of course, they have very, very important missions. We're talking about illegal migration.
Yes.
They're on the front line, and sometimes they have to be behind the enemy lines to do their jobs, DEA.
Yep.
Right. So just a shout out to all those folks, especially the folks I got to work with, because they're all good friends and they were great at what they did. And they're still great at what they do. So
to a certain degree, we're back to another subject that we bat around, and that is, what's an ambassador supposed to do?
Right. Yeah. Great. Let me ask you a question. What's an ambassador supposed to do? I have a thought here. What's an ambassador supposed to do? What is the role of an ambassador, Mr. Ambassador?
I like that setup question.
It was brilliant.
Yeah, it was really good. If you want to look at it, technically there's a letter from the president that more people ought to read. It's a delegation of authority from the president, very much like that given to a ship captain, and that is, you untie from the dock and you go out in water and that thing belongs to you, period. And that's somewhat like the letter the ambassador gets. More importantly, the ambassador's task is to add 2 and 2 and get 5. That's what any good manager does. That's Vince Lombardi. That's the Watsons at IBM, so on and so on. There are entrepreneurs today that look at a situation and say, I can make a lot more out of this than is apparent. Okay. So that's a first. And then the second is to say, I've made the most out of what I have. What are my gaps? Because the ambassador can attack gaps. The folks that he's given don't have as much gap-solving authority. So in one of my posts that I arrived at after a lot of private sector and project management time, we had our first country team meeting, and I said, we have to do a strategic plan for our country. And I can't remember who it was in the audience, but looked at me and they said, no. You do the strategic plan for the country, and we're supposed to execute it. Yeah. And I said, no, see, we're going to start with what you think your mission is and how it fits into how you see what we're trying to do here, and whether you have the resources to do that. Oh, I said, yeah, see, this is how it's going to work. You get through with that. And then we put it all together and we say, this is roughly what our strategic plan looks like. You can push and shove and so on and so forth among the existing USG assets, which we did. And we then put it down on paper and we sent it back to the remarkable Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, then Chester Crocker, and said to Chet, in the best corporate tradition of America, here's our game plan, boss. These are the resources that our folks think they need. My job is to get them those resources. Yeah, it's very simple.
Right.
And then with the other part of it is your Syria question. But all those resources don't add up to success. So what does the ambassador do to try to win the game that isn't available as it starts?
Right. And again, I mean, we've talked a lot about the process of selecting ambassadors,
Yeah.
training ambassadors, right? Empowering them. I think that's very, very, very important. You know my view on this. I think it's time to take a hard look at the way we've been selecting ambassadors. But the feeder is take a little bit more advantage of the talent pool, which, by the way, I think that the new administration is already doing.
Yeah.
So I'm very inspired by some of the things I've seen. And we have to break the mold on the way we were always doing things in the past, I think. So it's a critical position. And I always tell you, I was very fortunate to work with some great ambassadors overseas, and that makes a huge difference. When you have a mediocre ambassador or let's say a more passive ambassador, it's not a good situation. But when you have an ambassador that understands all the talent that she or he has at the table, at post, and then knows how to orchestrate and use those people and motivate them and inspire them, that can be a big game changer, and a small team can do a lot.
Yes.
And going back to some of your original point, about IKEA and the scenario being in West Africa, this is for any diplomatic mission around the world, right? It can be in the Middle East, it can be in Latin America, it can be in Asia. It can be anywhere, because in any country team, any embassy, you're going to have all these players, and they could go into crisis. I mean, even in Europe, very quickly. Let's think, just Ukraine, what's happening in Ukraine. Yeah. We're in a major war in Ukraine, right? And so that country team has to gel and be led by a very effective ambassador to be successful. Otherwise, we're not taking full advantage of all the resources, which are not endless, right? They're limited. And so when you say, 2 and 2 make 5, I like what you're saying. And I also want my high school algebra teacher to understand that I wasn't wrong with my math skills. 2 and 2 can equal 5. By the way,
which is how you end up in the intelligence world.
Don't even say it. Don't even say it. Some people scratch their head when they say, how'd that guy end up in the government? But no math skills here. I'm sorry. But I think it was Dostoevsky that said 2 and 2 equal 5. That was your point.
So.
Well, I know it was one of his.
I figured Rasputin had his Talmud.
Because his point was, it's not just about logic, it's also about emotion, heart. And I'm getting the heart signal that we are running out of time.
You're kidding.
No, I'm not. I don't kid. I don't joke. No joking here.
Well, we could take a short break for advertisement, 60 seconds, and then we could come back.
Well, the only advertisement I want to make is, again, for IWP. It's a great school, great people here. Thanks again to the team for putting this together. Thank you, sir, for being with us again. Hopefully it's not the last time. We can continue our banter, our discussions.
Exactly.
And thank you to you for what you're doing. I mean, when we talk about transition, we talk about what's coming down the road. You know my views. I think foreign policy-wise, we have a lot of problems and we have a lot of challenges and we have a lot of work to do. But one of the things that's inspiring to me is I see the students here at IWP. I know some of the young people that are in government service. They're very motivated to make a difference, and a positive difference for America. And then I see people like you and some of the people that you've put together at DSF who are doing this on a volunteer basis. We just spent last night a couple of hours with a group of them talking and planning and trying to figure out some ways to tackle some of these problems. And they're all doing it out of their love for this country and their desire to see positive change. So when you have that combination and the experience that you bring to the table, I think you can't go wrong. And our enemies should be fearful. Okay, I want them to shake in their boots.
The Chinese, they should be terrified of me.
Did they understand that?
That's a serious point. And that is what IWP is doing is badly needed. And that is current employees, folks that are in the trenches today for us, need as much training as they can absorb, period. And IWP, in having the student body that it does, is a great gift for the folks that want to do their job better, that want to hear from old folks that have done the jobs before. So it's a treat for me to be here, and I hope I can be here more.
I'd love to have that, sir. Well, thank you again. Thank you to everybody for taking the time to listen to us, and have a great, I guess we're going to say weekend. We're got a weekend coming up, don't we? If we can dig out of the snow.
At least within 6 days, we can expect a weekend. It may be a little closer.
Within 6 days.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So have a good 6-day weekend. That's what the ambassador said. We all get 6 days off.
Okay.
If you like our podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe. And if you are interested in learning more about the topics we covered here today and want to be a student at IWP, go to iwp.edu and click Apply Now.